Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Simon and I talk about music as my channel name would imply. And honestly, this feels a little bit weird doing a mini album reviews video because the last 4 videos that I uploaded were all individual album reviews. I mean, it hasn't been that long since my last mini review video, but it still just feels a little bit weird now because that's not really what I've been filming for the most part recently. And I do still have a few more individual reviews that I want to publish soon. There's one of an album from this year that I'm hoping to publish fairly soon if I can. And then also, I was going to try and do 2 throwback reviews in June because I didn't do any in May. I ended up only getting one of them out, so hopefully I'll do 2 in July, but I cannot promise anything with the throwback reviews. But for now, I have 7 albums that I want to talk about, all from this year in short form reviews. These are going to be a little bit longer than some of my mini reviews have been recently, but they're still fairly short because, again, it's mini reviews. That's kind of the point. But as always, it's just my personal opinion on these albums. I may have some negative things to say about some of them, but at the end of the day, it does not mean that I'm objectively right about these albums. I'm just telling you how I personally feel about them. You can totally have a different opinion than me, and that's totally fine. Again, it's not meant to be like, oh, I know exactly which albums are good and which ones are bad. But I know I say this at the start of every video, so yeah, again, just my personal opinion on these albums. I will not waste any more time, and I'll get right to talking about the albums, starting with... So I've never really been a big fan of drone music or ambient drone rock, stuff like that. I usually prefer music that sounds more, I don't know, musical. That said, it is absolutely a valid art form, and sometimes it can be interesting to me, or I can enjoy listening to it in the background, so I figured I may as well give this a shot because some of the other genre descriptions seemed kind of interesting. For example, I saw this described as drone metal. And what's interesting to me is that it's not instrumental, even if it's in a style of music that's often instrumental. Honestly, it kind of feels like it blends different kinds of music, where fans of both super avant-garde experimental music, fans of more accessible, poppier music, and fans of ambient drone and noise music might all be the right audience for this. And I gotta give them props for doing a pretty good job of bringing these different worlds together. I just wish I liked the final product more. Don't get me wrong, this isn't bad, but I often find the mixing a little rough with a bunch of the staticky sounds overpowering everything, and I feel like it could have been done in a way that kept all the glitchiness without sacrificing the pretty melodies and ethereal vibe. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the lyrics, which are not blowing me away or anything, and they are pretty simple, but I do find them mostly well written. About this album, band member Robin Waddy says, "All that I could reflect on was grief and hope, life and death, cause and effect, and shared experiences of being a human person." I kind of messed up the exact order of the words, but it gets the basic point across. And the album seems to focus largely on conflicts that humans face, like guilt and self-love, and also some mentions of God in ways that feel difficult to navigate. And the opening track talks about trading this body for a piece of ease. The album very much seems lost in its narrative, in search for more meaning or maybe just a clearer outlook on life, with one of the most powerful moments lyrically being on the closing title track, the line, "When does one feel the most? Is it in grief or is it in hope?" But I honestly just don't think the execution is particularly special. Again, I can admire a lot of what the band is attempting to do here, but it doesn't feel super impactful to me. Partially because of the mixing nitpicks I have, but also because there doesn't seem to be much musical evolution or progression throughout the course of the record. It almost feels like I'm listening to the same song over and over again, even if the closing track does build quite well. So in the end, it does enough things well for me to give it a strong 6 out of 10, and I almost rated it higher because on paper this feels like it should be more up my alley, which I'm kind of surprised I'm saying considering it is kind of drone music, but it's just not really clicking, and that's a real shame. Here's the new debut full-length album from this DJ who's known for wearing a horse mask over her face, and I'm not sure that I'd heard of her before this. I'm pretty sure she also sings her own songs too, but I'm not 100% sure about that. These songs sound like they're sung by the same person though. Anyway, this seems to have been getting quite a bit of acclaim, and I really did not know what to expect. And honestly, it's left me in a bit of an interesting place when it comes to discussing this album, and the ways that it made me think about music criticism in general. Because the first big observation I made about this is that while a lot of this album sounds very much like a 2020s album, the kind of thing you probably could not really imagine being from any decade prior, it also feels like it really pulls from late 2000s and early 2010s pop, where I also feel like had this dropped around that time, people might not be as high on it. That said, it also would have been a very different album. Vocally and stylistically, it reminds me a little bit of Porter Robinson, based on the small amounts of his music that I've listened to, with a little bit of the flourishes of Magdalena Bay, mixed with hooks that maybe feel a bit more retro, and it leads to an interesting experiment that I'm not convinced always works, but I can still respect and admire the ambition here, and I can tell horsegiirL is at least trying to be innovative and do something unique, without it feeling too forced. In other words, it feels like a very carefully crafted album that probably had a lot of effort put into it. It makes sense that this is her debut album, and I'm honestly kind of surprised that it's only been a year and a half since her debut EP. And when I talk about the creativity here, I'm largely referencing a lot of the lyrics, whether it be Rivers Run Free, seemingly being a literal track about bodies of water, or Connect the Dots, talking about someone who's guilty of a crime, only for said crime to turn out to be stealing the narrator's heart. And I'll also mention Organic Intelligence, in its way of critiquing AI by almost feeling like a forward-thinking look into the exact thing the title of the song would imply, as well as An Apple a Day, being pretty much an entire track based on the saying, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. There's very much a sense of silliness to this album, and I think she does a mostly good job of pairing it with the right instrumentation and production to enhance said silliness, and maybe even try and bring out more of an emotional side at points, where a song like Aura feels designed to be an earworm, and I cannot help but laugh at how one of the most 2010s sounding songs here is about someone having aura. And it actually is really damn catchy, even if it's the biggest example of a song here that I could see souring on me really quickly, even if it's probably one of my current favorites. I guess we'll wait and see. Now, when it comes to the production on this album, I think this is mostly solid from a mixing and mastering standpoint, according to my ears. And I actually quite like a lot of the percussion used and the way that the instruments complement each other. But it's not always in a style I fully love, where a lot of the 2010s vibes I was talking about come in some weaker drops and occasional moments where the bubblegum pop elements don't totally mix with a more EDM kind of sound, and thus I am left feeling a bit less hyped about this album than some critics are, where I can still appreciate the effort and I would absolutely recommend it to pop fans who haven't heard it yet, but for me it's probably just a light to decent 7 out of 10. I don't really notice many obvious low points, if any, and again, I very much respect what horsegiirL is attempting on this album. I just don't always think it works, and it leads to a bit of an underwhelming album as a whole. Still, the potential shown here is very promising, and I'm really excited to hear whatever she does next, because with a bit more focus and maybe a bit more ambition, something like this could really be up my alley. This is definitely a good introduction. So I've heard of American Aquarium before, but I've never actually listened to an album of theirs as far as I can remember. But I know they make country music, which is one of my favorite genres, and I figured it was finally time to check out one of their albums after hearing about them for so long. So how is New Ways to Lose? Well, honestly, it's not really one that gives me a whole lot to say. It's a country rock album that seems totally up my alley, and while I'm not totally wowed by this or anything, I'm an easy enough sell for this kind of thing that I might be a little bit higher on it than most people probably would. But that's no knock against the album. It's got pretty simple storytelling and conveying of emotions with a bunch of different topics, like the current economy on the opener Dollar General as the narrator watches their world collapse. Also the juxtaposition of appreciating people while also having a hard time saying goodbye on Favorite Hello, and the subtle call for people to look beyond their own world on History Repeats Itself, as well as the simple yet effective motivational lyrics on Out There in the Dark, where it works because the melodies, instrumentation, vocals, and production work together to make it come across as more sincere. And honestly, that can probably be said about most of this album, where they find the right vibes for these songs, with another big example being Just Like You, which I'm pretty sure is about missing someone who's passed away and the narrator wishing their kid could have met this person, and it's one of the album's most emotional moments. I also usually really like the country rock instrumentation on this album, where the band sounds locked in with each other, and BJ Barham's vocals here are great. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. I forgot to look it up to see the pronunciation. And honestly, this band seems like they'd probably be awesome live, and hearing this album also makes me really curious to hear their other albums. But look, an album like this kinda has a bit of a low ceiling in my opinion. It is a pretty straightforward album in its lane, where there's not a whole lot to it to really make it super memorable or anything, outside of maybe a few moments because they're just so well executed, like the sweet love song Twin Flames, which might actually be my favorite track on this album. Either way, I did really enjoy this, enough for me to give it a 7 out of 10, and I would recommend this to fans of country music if you haven't heard it yet. Otherwise, you might not really be missing out on much. Again, I'm an easier sell for this kind of thing, but I also think with maybe a bit more consistency in making the melodies and hooks pop off, and maybe a bit more variety, I could have called this great. And those are just small nitpicks on an album I otherwise like a whole lot. So yeah, I'm glad I gave this a chance. Here's a new album from this band I'd never heard of before. And I'm pretty sure this is their debut album, and it's been getting a lot of critical acclaim. I found this album online and saw very positive ratings, and I had no idea what to expect. And it's worth mentioning that the lyrics on this album are in Japanese, so I don't fully understand them, and thus I can't really take them into account as much as I would have liked to, even though I read some translated versions of them, and it does seem kind of interesting, where there seem to potentially be multiple characters, and I sort of wonder if there's some sort of story of a power dynamic, although it might just be my mind filling in the blanks because the opening track shows someone being trapped. I'm not really sure at all what the album's about, I just found some interesting little nuggets along the way. And from a musical standpoint, it's mostly solid, but I wish it were a bit more cutting edge, and maybe had a bit more experimentation. It is impressive, but I just feel like I've heard a lot of this before, and I wish it really stood out to me more in the grander scheme of things. I like some of the peppy grooves on tracks like Tsutsunuke and Throw In, the latter of which has a pretty strong hook. And the production on this album is pretty strong too, and I appreciate the peaceful ending thematically. Again, that is if I'm understanding it correctly through the translation. And I also think the closing track has some beautiful piano and is one of the better moments here sonically as well. So overall, I do think it's a pretty good album. I mean, most of it is fairly enjoyable, and it's not actively annoying or anything. So I will give it a 7 out of 10 for what it does well, but it's probably not really going to stick with me much. And while I can sort of see why this is getting praised as much as it is, it's not going to end up on my albums of the year list, that's for sure. Goose, not to be confused with Geese, are an American rock band who have been active for a little over a decade now, and the Apple Music description for this album calls them a never-quite jam band, which honestly feels pretty accurate on this album. And I saw that this came out, but I kind of forgot about it until a few days ago as of when I'm recording this, when someone recommended this to me, and I figured I may as well give it a shot. I usually listen to albums when people that I know recommend them to me, and it helps considering that this is a new album and it makes for review material, as a result of being a new album. The bad news, however, is I just don't think this is particularly special. It's overly long, a lot of the production feels underpowered and doesn't give the instruments the impact that they could have had, and the moments that actually have something going for them that contribute positively to this album are few and far between. And most of this feels pretty unnecessary, even if it is impressively performed a lot of the time. I like the drumming on You Are Here, which also does some interesting things with the very few words, which seems to be about the hard but necessary sacrifices you gotta make in life to achieve your full potential. In a world of all our own, there'll be nothing left to know. There'll be no place left for you to go. There's also some really nice guitar soloing on Faena, and I quite like the melodies on Good Times, End Times, a song that I think does a pretty good job of balancing optimism with fear, where despite the apocalyptic vibes, the song is quite upbeat and feels like it's trying to represent going out on a high if there's nothing that you can do to avoid the horrifying fate. And the song transitions pretty well into the next track too. But then you get some of the more unnecessary moments, like where they actually do go full-on jam band on Savinger's Spell, and that song really throws off the pacing of the record. Or the closing track, which reminds me way too much of Imagine Dragons, maybe like a song such as Bad Liar, and that's not a compliment. And there are a few very long tracks, like Good to Be, which is one of the clunkier moments on this record, with such awkward percussion and an oily production style which I don't like at all, and another very long song being Salt, which I also don't think helps the momentum of this album at all. But let's be real, there's not much momentum here to begin with. And I have not even mentioned the other 7+ minute track Nocturne, which is the second to last song here and is a continuation of the track right before it, that being Good Times, End Times, which I mentioned earlier. And despite the good transition, which I mentioned earlier, and the fact that this track is musically impressive, it's not really anything worth caring about, as it doesn't serve any purpose on the album that the song before it didn't already do. And I also just find that this one drags on way too long. And honestly, so does the album, which I really found to be underwhelming. There's a few short interludes which I find kind of effective, and again, I can admire the busy drumming and the way that the band supports each other musically from a technical standpoint, but I just don't really enjoy listening to this very much. I guess there's enough good moments for me to give it a very light 6 out of 10, but I don't think I'd call any of these songs great, and I highly doubt that I'll be returning to this album much at all. This was really disappointing. Going into this review, I decided to listen to every Temples album, which is something that I've been meaning to do for a while. Some of them multiple times each, except the ones that I'd already heard, which I just revisited once. And I can't really say I'm a huge fan of this band. Yeah, Volcano was a pretty good album, but even it felt like something wasn't quite hitting as much as it should be. And especially following 2023's overly long and honestly kind of mediocre Exotico, my expectations for this were not super high, even if Inner Space was a highlight from that album that I still like to this day. And I regret to inform you that this is in fact mediocre, maybe even more than its predecessor. And that's really unfortunate, especially because I like a lot of the fundamentals of this band's sound. They're very focused on melody, they have a retro sound while still aiming to keep things sounding fresh, and the lyrics often feel designed to fit each individual track. But unfortunately, the melodies here aren't very strong, and the production feels disjointed, where the instrumentals don't add up to more when all played together, and the grooves here feel way too commercial-esque, or maybe video game-esque in a way that I don't think helps these songs pop off at all. Honestly, there are moments where this reminds me way too much of Royal Blood, and as a non-fan of that band, I do not mean that as a compliment. And when it comes to the lyrics, I can't say I'm impressed. I'm not going to say it's awful or anything, and I'm well aware that there might be more to this, so take my analysis with a huge grain of salt, but it feels like an attempt at capturing the feelings of either being at peace in one's life or searching for that feeling, based too much on weak metaphors and imagery that doesn't really leave much of an impact on me. And look, it's one thing when an act that I'm a big fan of makes a really underwhelming album or the overall quality of their music starts to go down. That's obviously disappointing, even if I can still appreciate their earlier work. But what's even more frustrating is cases like this, where it's an act that I always saw potential in, but that they never fully lived up to. And then albums like this feel like the point where my hope is lost. And yeah, I honestly don't really see Temples making an album that's even as good as Volcano at this point. I would love to be wrong, but this album just feels underwritten, the goopy synths are way too much, and after a while I just get really sick of it. Strong 4 out of 10. If you're at all curious about getting into Temples, I'd recommend you check out any of their first 3 albums instead. They might not totally be my thing, but they're absolutely better than this. So here's another artist I never heard of before, whom I found on Bandcamp, and she's a singer-songwriter from Calgary, with this album probably being considered indie country or country folk or something like that. In other words, pretty much the type of thing that you'd totally expect to be up my alley. And yeah, this absolutely is. Jolene Marie is a great singer who really captures all these feelings of love and also of bleakness and despair incredibly well, where the subtle shifts in melody and tone make such a huge difference to the overall mood of these songs, and you could argue the meaning as well. The lyrics are quite simple on the surface, but I'd argue there's more nuance in the little details that provide more potential interpretations for the listener to make. Like how Aspens is a genuinely sweet love song, but also poses the question about what more could be going on, or whether or not the narrator is too attached. Or how Lover seems to be about loving someone who has serious mental health problems, and yet different ways of reading it present other possible storylines, where the narrator themselves might be the one who's struggling more. Or I could also point to Dreaming, where the narrator is asking about a precious moment with a lover, but then starts to question the reality of it, which seems to be a theme throughout the album, not as much in a philosophical existential questioning way, more so in the sense that a lot of this album poses the question to the audience of whether to take all these stories literally or not, where maybe it dives into a dreamlike narrative such as on that last track I just mentioned called Dreaming, but it feels much more emotionally unsure than anything else. And this narrative reaches arguably its most heartbreaking moment on Mundane, where the narrator is feeling lost in life and struggling to start a new path, and it's written with some absolutely devastating lines. And honestly, the music captures pretty much all these moments unbelievably well, with a smoky production that feels like a dark cloud casting a shadow on a sunny day, and the songs feel perfectly designed for this kind of sound. It's a shockingly powerful listen that I got really lucky to find, and it's definitely an album that you gotta be in the right mood to listen to, and it's also probably not for everyone, but man, this is great. Honestly, it reminds me a little bit of that Angel Olsen album in 2022 that I really liked at the time, but since then has cooled on me a lot. I don't see the same thing happening here, and it's a very welcome replacement for me. No shade to that album, it's fine, but this one is absolutely stellar. It's easily at least a strong 8 out of 10 for me. In fact, I could rate it higher. What an amazing surprise, and one that I cannot recommend enough. And yeah, that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. I'm realizing now we are more than halfway through 2026. That's insane. I don't know how that happened. The time has gone by so quickly, it feels like. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure what my review schedule will look like in the near future. I'm continuing to obviously post reviews like I am here, and I will be doing that for the rest of the year. And, you know, in future years as well. But I'm saying for this year, I'm going to try and stay on a fairly consistent schedule. I'm surprised I've been able to keep this up this long this year. My original goal going into the year was I was going to try and aim for 350 albums reviewed, and I'm already at over 200, and we just hit the halfway mark of the year, so I should be able to accomplish that goal. I'm thinking I'll probably exceed it, but I guess we'll see. I will be quite busy in the near future with work, and I'll also be taking more school courses in the fall, so I'm not entirely sure where I'll find the time to post a lot more reviews. They might slow down a little bit, but we'll see. I'm not going to really look that far ahead right now. For now, I just wanted to get these reviews done, and I'll start working on more mini reviews and some individual reviews as well, including some throwback reviews hopefully soon. But again, I cannot promise anything. I think that's all I really got to say for now. Thank you for watching. Feel free to let me know in the comment section what you thought of these albums and or what you thought of my video. And yeah, I will see you all soon.